Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Tiger Talk. This month we're going to talk about MTSS and some services for meeting individual student needs at the school. So we'll come to that in just a minute. Just a few updates I want to share before we get to that today. First of all, I want to share it is School Board Appreciation Month. Marshall Public Schools is joining school districts throughout the state to salute our local school board members during Minnesota School Board Recognition Month through all February. This month is designed to recognize the contributions made by Minnesota school board members who are charged with governing public education under state law. Our school board members are responsible for formulating school district policy, approving curriculum, maintaining school facilities, and adhering to state and local education law. Local concerns and complexities of school finance, including budget and taxation, all sorts of fun things like that, require them to spend many hours in board training programs and study to enhance their understanding of these issues. I want to thank these public servants to the Marshall School Board, whose commitment and civic responsibility make local control of public schools in our community possible. Thank you to Matt Coleman, to Bill Malso, Sarah Runchie, Sarah Brink, Jeff Chapman, and Bill Swope. Appreciate everything that they do for us at the schools. We also recently celebrated a couple of other appreciation weeks. It was Paraprofessional Week and School Counselor Appreciation Week at the school. So paraprofessionals and counselors are the backbone to Marshall Public Schools. They're instrumental in providing one-on-one assistance to our students, providing an equitable learning environment for all of our students. We appreciate the people that we have that are dedicated to the schools and to our students. So thank you to all of our paras and our counselors. And there's too many there for me to list names individually today. Also, coming up next week is School Bus Appreciation. A lot of appreciation months going on, and we certainly want to say a big thank you to our bus drivers as well. They have a big job essential to Marshall Public Schools. We place so much responsibility on our drivers and completing the task of delivering students safely to school and with care each day. Southwest Coaches has been a partner of Marshall Public Schools for 67 years. We continue to work together to provide this service to our students. Thank you to the transportation partners. We appreciate you as well. It's a lot of specific people we want to call out and thank this month. So Jackie Budden is with me today. Jackie is our Director of Special Education. Jackie's been with the district for how many years? I didn't give you that one ahead of time. 12 years. Number of years, and Jackie does a great job managing all those special services for students that have some additional needs. One of the big pieces, Jackie, we talk about a lot is MTSS. Not specific to special ed, even though that's kind of your realm. It's a side piece maybe to special ed. It might be a way to explain that. Why don't you start and share with our viewers kind of what is MTSS and why is that so important for our schools?
Yeah, so MTSS is multi-tiered systems of support, and really the bulk of the work that we do at Marshall Public Schools falls under that umbrella. When we think about our professional learning communities, our continuous improvement plans, and response to intervention is probably the most closely linked to special education because that really is the process that we go through to ensure that we're meeting student needs. And so when we find that a student is struggling in school, whether it be academic, social, emotional, behavioral needs, we start by backing up and really taking a look at how they're doing compared to peers and try to spot a breakdown in it. And so when we look at response to intervention underneath the umbrella of multi-tiered systems of support, that's really how that ties nicely with special education.
Oh, that makes sense. So we think about special education, a student with an IEP would be when we're talking special education, but so many other things prior to maybe a student receiving an IEP that some other supports could be in place, and this is kind of everything together, thinking about those pieces. So when you think about a student that's struggling at the schools, in one of those different areas that you talked about, what steps might we take, or might a student or a teacher take when they see a student struggling in any one of those areas?
Yeah. So when we really look at response to intervention, it's a pyramid shape, and so we anticipate that 80% of our students are going to do just fine at the bottom core level tier. And so that's really where we're just looking at the regular instruction that occurs in the classroom, using the curriculum, using good teaching strategies, and they're going to do just fine at that level. But then when they begin to struggle is when we would anticipate students moving into Tier 2. And at that level, it's about 15% of the kids that, generally speaking, you can anticipate are going to need that level of support. At that point in time, we're really backing up and saying, okay, so what's missing for this student? Is there a certain skill that we're missing? We start to look at providing interventions at a certain skill level so that we're backfilling those gaps in order to help them continue to meet those learning targets.
Yeah. and we talk about providing those interventions or adding some extra supports, what kind of staff might that be? Is that the classroom teacher, or is that somebody else in the school that's doing that?
Yeah, so typically at that point in time, it's the classroom teacher, or it could be a reading interventionist, or we have academic support strategists that come in and work with our students. And so it just depends upon the building and what their makeup is of their different staff who can come in and provide those additional supports for the students.
Sure. So a lot of people in place to handle this, but it all kind of starts with that core. And you mentioned 80% is kind of our target, 80% of students being successful in that core instruction. So when we're looking at core instruction, it's a big part of our planning, and when we're picking curriculum and we're talking about meeting needs in general, comparing those standards to the curriculum, and how are we providing that for students and making sure that we are being successful with about 80% of the students before we even do something else. So let's say we try a small group or we provide some extra intervention, and we have a student who, even after like a smaller group you mentioned, the data is still showing they're maybe not being successful yet. What happens there?
Yeah, so that's where we're at the tip of the pyramid, and we anticipate that it should be 5% or fewer of our students who really require that level of intervention. But at that point in time, we're going to probably start to do some diagnostic assessments so that we're able to pinpoint exactly. So we know that they're struggling with decoding and reading, but we want to backtrack and really pinpoint what part of the reading process has broken down. And then from there, we'll work with teachers to target a specific intervention that will really meet where that skill has broken down. Oftentimes that might be one-on-one instruction or a very small group. The intensity of it certainly ramps up, because this is where we're really going to make our effort to close the gap before we look at referring for a special education evaluation.
What about with EL services or with some other things? Is there some interventions that might be provided even if it's not special ed?
Yes, good question. So EL, certainly if a student's eligible for English language learner support, they're already getting an extra dose of services. Let's say that it's an EL student, plus we have additional concerns because they're discrepant even from that small group of kids. We're going to ask that we provide another intervention there for them. Sometimes it looks like Title I, that they're coming in and providing some services for students. And so it's not discrepant against anybody. I mean, anybody who's struggling, we're going to bring in through this process.
Right, and it's identifying exactly where that need is, and that's when you talk about the different diagnostic tests or some of those things. So the diagnostic tests are breaking down and identifying really exactly what is the problem, so that we're not providing a treatment for something that somebody doesn't have. You think about, you go to the doctor and you don't just get a same medication for everybody. The doctor finds out exactly what's wrong before they give you a prescription for it. So same thing in the school. We want to find out exactly what's going on. And I think that's a good point. You talk about the English language learners. We have a lot of students who English isn't their first language, but that doesn't exclude them from receiving special ed services or automatically qualify them for special services, because by default they're probably going to struggle more than the student who spoke English growing up in the classroom. So just a lot of pieces to figure out and a lot of staff in place to make that happen. So yeah, that's really good. When we think about the level of supports, all those different pieces, how do we identify which level of support specifically a student might need to help them ensure progress?
Yeah, that's really where we're backtracking always. And so sometimes it might be that we might look at the whole class or grade level scores from those formative assessments that we're utilizing and say, oh gosh, it looks like the majority of the class didn't get this. And so that's when the recommendation is going to be, well, let's go back and reteach. Let's try a different teaching strategy. Perhaps we need to allocate a little bit more time right now for this particular unit of study to make sure that we are still getting 80% of the students through with that core instruction. If we've ruled that out, then that's really where we're going to start taking a hard look at that data, just to determine who belongs in a group together, who can we provide some extra services and supports to.
Yeah. So you talk about interventions. That's we use a lot of different slang in education. It's maybe different for others. So let's talk a little bit about what an intervention might look like.
Yeah, so an intervention, really, we expect that to be research-based. And so, response to intervention has been around for probably 20 years, and it just always takes a little different name, a little different pathway. But at the end of the day, there's organizations across the U.S. that they're spending a lot of time and resources determining what interventions work for different skill deficits. And so we ask that staff work to choose an intervention that is specific to the deficit. We ask that they implement it with fidelity. And so if the intervention was researched to be 5 days a week for 30 minutes, then we would ask that that occur 5 days a week for 30 minutes, because we know that that's the design of it, and that's how we're going to be successful. So, really we're looking for fidelity of implementation. We're looking for it to be targeted to the skill, and it's going to always be in addition to that core instruction.
I think that's a good point to make too, because sometimes we think, oh, there's this guided reading group, for example, took place. That's a small group that happened, but that's not an intervention, because that's something that everybody's receiving that. So that's
Right.
part of our core, or our tier 1, we might call that, but it just gets confusing when we talk about these different tiers.
Yep.
So you think about tier 1 is everybody. The tier 2 and tier 3, break that down a little bit and talk about what's the difference between tier 2 versus tier 3.
So tier 2, we're going to have a few more students, and they're going to be in a small group, and they're going to be receiving an intervention, but it might not be daily, it might not be for as great of amount of time. But certainly when we've advanced somebody to a tier 3, that's where we're going to really expect that it's going to be happening very regularly and for a longer amount of time. At tier 3, at that point, once we've given it sufficient amount of time to occur for the intervention to work, that's when we might say to parents, hey, you know what, we've been visiting with you now for several months about our concerns with your child and their skills in reading, and at this point in time, we really think that it's time to move forward with a special education evaluation, and we start to have that conversation with parents. And so, special education, it feels big and scary, but it's not. I mean, by design, we're there to come in and add that extra layer of support to make sure that we can help them to make progress, that they've got the supports in place, accommodations and modifications to ensure that they can be successful in our classrooms.
Right, and I think that's a good point too. We should talk about just a little bit. We talk about these interventions. You don't have to be in special ed or be on IEP to receive interventions. You don't have to be in EL either. I mean, there's a lot of different kids receiving different types of interventions. Parents certainly are part of the conversation along the whole way. We kind of skipped over that part maybe a little bit, but you mentioned it here. So I think that's good to call out that is part of that. We want to work together with parents and partner with parents and talk about, here's what we're seeing, here's some challenges we see your student having compared to peers, because all of it kind of gets compared back to some normed data. It's not just the teacher, well, I feel Johnny is struggling with this. It's really looking specifically at some data points to make that happen. And then I think the other thing that we should talk about maybe just a little bit here is when we talk about those different interventions, there are some interventions we're providing to determine really what is the level of support the student needs to be successful. We want to make sure we're providing an equal playing field for all students. And then once we find that level of support, then we talk about, is this something that the teacher can just continue to happen, or do we move forward with some additional testing and ensure there's a more formal plan, be it an IEP or a 504 plan or a health plan, because this could be reading, it could be math, it could be behaviors, there's lots of different things that these interventions might be around. It's not all one, and some students might need interventions in multiple areas to be successful in school, and that's okay too. We just really need to identify what that looks like and what that feels like for each one, with the parent being part of that conversation as well. I'm losing track of where we're going with this. So let's say we've been providing a number of interventions. We've identified a student needs help. We've identified they maybe need a plan. We get to a tier 3 intervention. We've been doing this very intense intervention for a number of weeks with a student, and the data is showing they're still not making some progress. What happens then?
That's when we have the conversation with parents about having the evaluation. Parents are a part of that whole process, so that if there are concerns that they have at home as well that maybe just haven't been spotlighted at school, we can take all of that into consideration, because our goal is always the concerns might have originated in math, but parents are saying, hey, but they're so frustrated at home, we're seeing a lot of behaviors. Then we're going to take a deeper dive and really look at that, so that we can make sure that the areas that are of concern, we're going to evaluate, determine whether or not there are needs for special education, and then from there, if they're eligible, we'll propose a plan to make sure that they have the adequate supports.
That makes a lot of sense, making sure we're providing all those different supports for people. Have you found the pandemic has an influence? We hear so many things blamed back, and that's a COVID problem. Certainly we went through some years where instruction was different and felt different, and providing one-on-one individualized instruction was harder for a few years. But what kind of impact are you seeing even now?
Yeah, so I would say that not just specific to Marshall Public Schools, but really when I read things across the nation or as part of my professional groups, certainly there is evidence to say that the pandemic has impacted kids in school. I mean, we've got some lagging learning that is occurring. We've got some gaps that need to be filled. And then that sometimes comes out as additional special education evaluations that maybe really aren't necessary. And that's why it's really important that we focus in on the MTSS process, the RTI process, to really rule out everything that we can before we refer a student for a special education evaluation. Certainly I would say that across the nation, they're going to cite things that we've got high rates of student absenteeism, and they are relating that back to the pandemic. Kids got comfortable being at home. That was easier, right, than coming to school and dealing with the social with. Certainly, we hear a lot about mental health crisis. That was highlighted during the pandemic, and I would say we still feel that very much so, where kids are really still struggling with that mental health, and that is an area of eligibility that can come in through special education. And then when you tie those two things together, if you're missing school and you've got mental health, we're going to see some behaviors pop up. And again, that's where special education is going to come in and have those support plans to help with kids being successful in school. And then academics is obviously still impacted, and that's across the U.S. I mean, it's not a Marshall Public Schools specific. In terms of our numbers, I would say that when I compare from January of 2021 until January of this year, we're up a total of 14 additional students, and that's taking into account kids who have moved in and out of the district, no longer eligible, and that may not seem like a lot when you consider our total enrollment, but it is significant because those 14 kids are spread across every building. Yep. And so that certainly begins to create some staffing concerns because you have extra kids in each building who need that support. And then as those numbers increase, it just becomes more difficult to even hire the professionals that we need to be able to meet those needs.
Yeah, and when you think about staffing for students with IEPs, for example, is kind of where we're at. It's not necessarily, there's not an easy ratio to figure out because it's so driven by each individual student. What's their level of need? Do they need additional support personnel outside of that special classroom, a paraprofessional, for example, or or
speech,
how much of the day, or
PT,
speeches, or
OT,
all those different pieces that are part of that, and it all has to tie back to that educational need to fit at the school too. And there's a lot of work, a lot of things on your plate with that to make that all work. You do a really nice job keeping on top of that. Jackie, anything that we haven't talked about today that you think we should share with our listeners?
No, I mean, I think maybe the one area that we did hit on is certainly our children in the community who are not school age, and that would be through the Help Me Grow system that Minnesota has set up. A lot of parents don't realize that in Minnesota, if your child was born with a significant disability or a health condition, or you have concerns at home or from daycare, we are a state that provides services to kids from birth on. And I would say that certainly in Minnesota as a whole, the Help Me Grow numbers, the referrals that are coming in from medical providers, social workers, daycares, neighbors, friends, they have had a huge increase since the pandemic. People say that a lot of that is because children maybe missed those wild child visits during the pandemic. Parents didn't get out into the communities and experience as many social environments. Our kids didn't go to daycare, and so we're lagging in a lot of skills. Referral coming in with young kids having a lot of needs.
Right.
So
I remember last summer you called near the end of the summer and said we're seeing a lot of referrals. We need to add some staff. So that's something that we're constantly monitoring too. And it's another spot where it really is driven by the student, it's very individualized student needs. So. If parents are listening, they think, I got some questions about this. Who should they reach out to?
I would say they can reach out to me. My phone number's on the district website. Also, Minnesota has a Help Me Grow website. And so certainly if you're not ready to have a conversation with myself or another school provider, that would be a good place.